you, Miss Lori, and teens as well for the special music tonight. Ruth chapter 2 tonight, if you'll turn there, and that song that was just sung dovetails perfectly with our study tonight. Appreciate Miss Lori and God's grace at work in her and being willing to sing out of what God is teaching her tonight. Ruth chapter 2, and we're going to look at verses 1 through 17 tonight. And really the pivotal chapter of the book as far as setting up what God is about to do in this family. Ruth chapter 2. Just this word, because I may forget to say this at the end, but I want to strongly encourage you, if you're a part of our 55 and up, 55 plus group of adults, that our meeting is this Wednesday, the first of those. It'll be at 10:30 a.m. If you're visiting with us tonight, we'd love to have you be a part of that. It'll be here at the church. You'll come in through the central lobby and have lunch together. Just bring your brown bag lunch with you, and we'll have some prayer and hymn sing and encouragement from God's Word and fellowship. So I invite you to be a part of that new group starting this coming Wednesday at 10:30 a.m. And Lord willing, if you guys behave yourselves, it'll continue the first Wednesday of every month at 10:30. And behave is a somewhat subjective, I guess, evaluation. So we'll see how that goes. But to encourage you to be a part of that this Wednesday, and if you have questions, you can see Brother Moses about that. Let's stand together if you're able to do so tonight. Ruth chapter 2. We're going to look at verses 1 through 17, but let's read just the first few verses of the chapter to set the table for our study tonight. Ruth chapter 2, let's begin in verse 1. And Naomi had a kinsman of her husband's, a mighty man of wealth, and of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. So we see this man introduced to us for the first time. And Ruth the Moabitess said unto Naomi, Let me now go to the field and glean ears of the corn after him, in whose sight I shall find grace. And she said unto her, Go, my daughter. And she went and came and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and her hap was to light on the part of the field belonging unto Boaz, which was of the kindred of Elimelech. And so you see that reiteration there. Verse 4, And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said unto the reapers, The Lord be with you. And they answered, The Lord bless thee. Then said Boaz unto the servant that was set over the reapers, Whose damsel is this? And the servant that was set over the reapers answered and said, It is the Moabitess damsel that came back with Naomi out of the country of Moab. And she said, I pray you, let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. So she came and hath continued even from morning until now, that she tarried a little in the house. Then said Boaz unto Ruth, Hearest thou not, my daughter? Go not to glean another field, neither go from hence, but abide here fast by my maidens. Let thine eyes be on the field, that they do reap, and go thou after them. Have I not charged the young men, that they shall not touch thee? And when thou art athirst, go into the vessels, and drink of that which the young men have drawn. Notice this in verse 11 or verse 10. Then she fell on her face and bowed herself to the ground and said unto him, Why have I found grace in thine eyes? It's a great question. That ye should take knowledge of me, seeing I am a stranger. And Boaz answered and said unto her, It hath fully been shown unto me all that thou hast done unto thy mother-in-law since the death of thine husband, how thou hast left thy father and thy mother in the land of thy nativity, and art come into a people which thou knewest not heretofore. Verse 12, notice this, The Lord recompense thy work, and a full reward be given thee of the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings thou art come to trust. And so we've been talking about God's tender providence, God working in real time and space to provide us His will and plan. And tonight I want to look at this aspect of it, His tenderness in our circumstances. Let's pray and ask the Lord to help us. Lord, thank you for your goodness. Thank you for this day, a day just replete with blessings and miracles and decisions and directions that have been set, and we pray that you would help each of us to follow through on those things. Pray, Father, as we now enter a study of your word again tonight in this precious little book of Ruth, that, Lord, we would be convinced that you are tender and that you are over all things. You're involved in all things, and your providence is seen if we'll simply look for it and yield to it. And pray that you would bless our time tonight, bless the preaching and teaching of your word, we pray. In Christ's name, amen. You may be seated. Thank you. I don't know if you ever heard this illustration before, but as it relates to our circumstances, I don't know if you've ever tried to bite into a raw potato. I had some cousins of mine, they would literally just eat food out of their garden, grab a tomato, grab a whatever. But one of my cousins, he was a little strange. And he would just literally grab a potato or an onion and just gnaw on the thing. And I'm like, and his breath wasn't so great after the onion one especially. But isn't it amazing how hot water, when you boil a potato, it changes. Like, yeah, maybe the butter, the sour cream, the salt, the cheese, and all the chives, all the other stuff we throw in it also adds some flavor. But it's amazing how hot water softens a potato, right? What does hot water do to an egg? It hardens it. It's amazing to me how the same set of circumstances can tenderize and soften one heart and life, and the exact opposite effect is given. Miss Lori just sang about that in that song. It can also move us in the opposite direction. And so the takeaway would be, it's less about our circumstances, it's more about our view of God, who is in control of those circumstances. Nothing is random with God. And so if we believe that, we believe He loves us, He's over all things, He's involved in all things, then we see the circumstances around us through the lens of God, who He is, His character, and the fact that He loves us and wants to use those circumstances for His plan and purpose. Now, in Ruth chapter 2, we see God setting up the specific circumstances needed to do His reconciling work in this family, His redemptive plan in this family that was so embittered, so broken, so lost, so destitute. God was going to use these circumstances. And so the question tonight is this: in a world filled with so much random circumstances, things just happen, que sera, sera, whatever will be, how do we instead see and submit to a God who is divinely orchestrating circumstances to bring about opportunities in our walk with Him? So let's talk about two circumstantial provisions that we see in Ruth's life that I think are in your life tonight if you'll look for them. The circumstances of life and seeing what God is trying to do through these provisions. First of all, for a few minutes tonight, let's talk about the areas where we see God guiding, where He is leading and working in the guiding aspects of our circumstances. Our oldest that was just up singing and now is in youth group tonight, we're having conversations about him getting his driver's license. And I have to be honest with you, I am just not there yet, okay? He may be there, but I'm not. And a friend of mine who is a driver's ed teacher, which, I mean, if you're bored, start doing driver's ed, okay? That would spice things up a bit. But he was saying to me, he had called me and then I called him back and he said, "I'm sorry I didn't take your call. I was with a car full of students." And I'm like, "You're good, man. Just focus, okay? You're the guide. You're the one you've got the little emergency brake set beside you in front of you on the passenger side. You focus on that. When you get done with that, you can return my call." That's a good excuse to not take that call. Can I just say to you tonight, as it relates to the believer who says they believe in a God who is loving and is in control of all things, that they should also believe that circumstances are anything but random. I believe this, and there are folks, especially I remember one of the joys I had as an assistant pastor for a number of years is I would transport missionaries from the airport to our church or from their church back to the airport. We had a lot of missionaries that came through the ministry I was a part of in Michigan. And I remember especially one gentleman named Dr. Point de Jour. He pastored the largest African-American Baptist church in the world in Haiti. And the satanic things he would battle. But I remember him talking to me as we were in the car just making small talk. And he was talking about how he believed every detail of his life, God was in it. I remember him talking about he'd pray before which color of socks he would put on in the morning, or those kind of things, like the little things matter to him. And there was a power of God upon his life that I could only aspire to have someday in my own relationship with the Lord. But he was convinced that God was in the details. We would talk about the devil's in the details. Well, God, equally so and more so, is in the details. And so He is guiding, He is working in things that feel random, and yet we see clearly in the text tonight are nothing like that. All right, let's talk about a few areas as it relates to His guidance in our circumstances. How do we relate to a God who is working through things that feel random or just kind of secular or neutral in their orientation? Number one, jot this down. Allow God to be tender where you are unknowingly guided. Allow God to be tender where you are unknowingly being guided. You do know today that God is a part of this day. He made this day, right? With all of its challenges, all of its blessings. And so God is involved in these details. He's wanting to work out His will in our lives, and He's using these circumstances, including where my pulpit was just a moment ago. I just realized it was out of center, and being OCD a bit tonight, I had to tweak that there, speaking of circumstances. But God has you here tonight for a reason, right? Where you're going to be tomorrow, the things you're going to navigate tomorrow, those things are all a part of God's working. And so we need to allow God to be tender, or He is guiding us in ways we don't even realize. All right, case in point, look at our text tonight, a few ways in which God was guiding Naomi and Ruth, and they didn't even realize it. This is fascinating to me. Look at verse 1. And Naomi had a kinsman of her husband's. Number 1, jot this down underneath of that. We are guided by God to unknown relationship. Guided toward unknown relationships. Relationships that are going to go further and expand into things He's going to use as building blocks of His plan and purpose for us. Boaz was a relative of Elimelech, one who could fulfill the role of a kinsman redeemer, this deceased husband. We see now that things are not quite as bleak as Naomi had ascertained earlier back in chapter 1, verses 11 to 13. And so for the person reading this, we know the story. Most, if not all of us, have read the entire book of Ruth, but pretend you haven't. And all of a sudden, across the horizon comes this new man, this man Boaz, and God already knows His intentions with this man and His provision through this man. Despite all the emotions and the despair that was in the heart of Naomi, God was already leading her and this daughter-in-law toward an unknown relationship. I've shared this before, but I remember hearing a man I respect in the coaching profession, basketball-wise, he said this statement several times: things are never as good or as bad as they feel. Never as good and probably never as bad as they feel. And I think sometimes our emotions convince us that God is not working and there's nothing going on right now that will lead to His redemptive plan in my life. And so don't allow your emotions to convince you that you're alone and hopeless. There's a God with connections. There's a God with relational connections that's bringing people into your life, a new relationship that will lead in the direction that He has for you. And so trust Him to be tender during those seasons. All right, then secondly, notice the middle of verse 1. It says, a kinsman of her husband's, a mighty man of wealth of the family of Elimelech. That's key, and his name was Boaz. Number 2, God is often guiding us, even when we don't know it, toward unknown might. The word there is might. So He's leading us toward relationship with a kinsman kind of redeemer that He's positioning in our lives. Number 2, He guides us toward unknown might. The word mighty man that's found here is translated in 1 Samuel chapter 16 and verse 18 as a man of valor. In 1 Chronicles 28 and verse 1, it's translated as mighty man. In 1 Samuel 9:1, man of wealth or affluence. 1 Kings 11:28, very able. Over and over, this expression is used of those with resources, those with might that could be used for good. And so this man was a mighty man. I think to this point, Naomi's future had been shaped by Elimelech, right? The one who had said, God is my king, and yet a man who had several failures. And it's interesting to me that God is now shifting Naomi's focus from her relationship to Elimelech with all of his shortcomings to now be open to new workings. She was not going to remarry, but God was going to use this relationship with her daughter-in-law to redeem her family, this new man that God was bringing into their lives. Can I bring this into the New Testament context for just a moment? Would you go to Romans chapter 5 for a moment? This idea of one man. I love this expression as it relates to our relationship with Jesus Christ. Romans chapter 5. As I was just reading through, and it's amazing to take this and, read through the literal story, but then think of our relationship with God. How much we don't deserve His intervention, His tenderness in our lives, and yet through Christ, our Redeemer, God provides that for us. Romans chapter 5. And look, if you will, at verse number 12. Just notice the one man aspects that are referenced here. Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. Go down to verse 15. But not as an offense, so also is the free gift. For if through the offense of one many be dead, much more by the grace of God, much more the grace of God and the gift by grace, which is by one man, Jesus Christ, hath abounded unto many. Verse 17, for if by one man's offense death reigned by one, much more they which receive abundance of grace and of the gift of righteousness shall reign in life by one, Jesus Christ. And then lastly, verse 19, for as by one man's disobedience many were made sinners, so by the obedience of one shall many be made righteous. And so here's the kind of, I think, application for us as it relates to Naomi being open to Boaz, this new man, to let go of Elimelech and the shortcomings and the failures and the part even that she had played in those decisions, and to be open to this new man that God was bringing. Here it is. Listen to this. Every circumstance in your life and mine, including the difficult ones, has, whether we realize it or not, the potential to lead us closer to the man, Jesus Christ. The expression of God's tender providence, the ultimate, the perfect expression of a God who loves us and is involved in our lives. And so here would be my challenge to you. Could it be the challenging things you're facing tonight in your family, in your body, in your mind, in our world, is actually to draw us closer to the man, Jesus Christ, the one who alone will never disappoint? And would you allow Jesus to guide you in those difficult settings closer to Him? I could have each of us share tonight the things we know about Jesus. And when I say know, I don't mean as in academically. I'm talking we've experienced things with Jesus. And I think if we're honest, most of us, the context in which those things were known and still are known were not in easy times, but difficult moments. Would you see that? Would you sense that? Would you trust that God is guiding you closer to Himself, closer to Jesus through those challenges that you're facing? All right, go back, if you will, now to our text, to verse number 2. Ruth chapter 2, and now verse 2. And our pace will pick up a bit as we go now. Verse 2. And Ruth the Moabitess said unto Naomi, all right, so we kind of have this aside that the narrator gives us. This is not something that Naomi is aware of, verse 1. It's not something that Ruth was privy to at this moment. And Ruth the Moabitess said unto Naomi, let me now go to the field and glean ears of corn after him, in whose sight I shall find grace. And by him, she's just meaning that in a generic sense. And she said unto her, go, my daughter. And she went and came and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And her hap, we'll talk about what that means in just a moment, was to light on a part of the field belonging unto Boaz, who was of the kindred of Elimelech. All right, number 2, jot this down. Allow God to be tender where you are progressively guided. So you're unknowingly guided. Number 2, you are progressively guided. The other day I was reading a little anecdote story submitted to Reader's Digest. A dad was sharing this little story, and we've talked about dad jokes, the groaner jokes that just, only dads or guys laugh at. The rest of everybody in the family just groans when they hear it. But this is just a perfect example of this. The dad said every Sunday on the way to church, we would have to stop at a railroad crossing. And each time, he was reflecting back to earlier in his relationship with his daughter, each time I'd tell my 12-year-old daughter, a train just went by. Know how I can tell? It left its tracks. And so he would say that joke. And he said the first few times he told this joke, he would get a moan when he would say the joke. His daughter would just moan in the back seat, just like, oh my goodness, Dad, come on. After a while, he said, every time they would pull up to the crossing, all I would do is look in the rearview mirror, and she would smirk. She knew the joke. It was there. And now his daughter is grown and married, and he said, my daughter's now out of the house, but every time I cross the tracks, I think of her. Can I just challenge us tonight? There's a track record with God. We have a point of reference with God, a God who progressively leads us. That means we can smile in circumstances that we don't know where it's going, but we know God is working in them. And He's going to show us one day, 1 second, 1 moment at a time. Are you okay with that with God? Because He loves you. He's tender and He's the one in charge, but He tends to lead us without showing us the whole picture. And the beauty of following God is it's just kind of this unveiling tapestry of His will. It's just one chapter, one syllable at a time. Are we willing to let Him guide us in that fashion? There are things tonight I wish I knew about the future. There's some things I'm glad I don't know about the future. The specifics of it. I just have to follow Him day by day. Isn't that a gift? Don't chafe under that. Don't resent that. Don't allow that to distort your view of God. See it as his gift to you, a finite being who only has grace for today. In this moment, and each day, he'll take care of what's next in our walk with him. So it's a progressive feel, this guidance we see in Ruth's life, and I believe also he shows to us. All right, let me give you a couple things under that as it relates to Ruth. Number one, we should be guided through progressive initiative. All right, the word there is initiative. Notice the initiative of Ruth. She just does the next thing. She can't fix the family. She can't get all these issues. She can't resolve things with her bitter mother-in-law. She can't restore the family, but she just does what she can. Look at verse 2 again. She says, "Let me now go to the field and glean ears of corn after him in whose sight I shall find grace." And so we see initiative on her part. The law of the land, as Ruth began to understand the way things worked, there was often provision for the rights of the poor in Israel. They could gather grain in the field after the harvester had passed through, and they could pick up enough to provide for their family. And so Ruth does not wait for someone else to serve her. She initiates. She takes the initiative. And and Naomi is willing to encourage her and support her in that. Just yesterday, had some folks, one of our ladies drop off some stuff at the housewarming gifts. I had someone give me my birthday pie every year they give me for pecan pie. I got that today. And just different ways that people love on me. I'm so grateful for that. You have people in your life that just show initiative. They do things to help you. They do things that really they don't have to do, but they initiate with you. Can I encourage you to look for those who seem to have that willingness to help you? They probably are part of God's way of leading you forward. Don't close off to those relationships. Be open to and demonstrate initiative on your part in your relationship with those around you. And so guided, we see God is going to use this initiative in his plan for Ruth. What if Ruth had not gone? What if she weren't there? What if she weren't there when the conversation between Boaz and his hired man that's overseeing the harvesters, what if she had not been working in the field? What maybe would have been missed? And so guided through progressive initiative. I don't know how to fix everything, but I know what I'm supposed to do right now. I know what I'm supposed to do this evening and probably tomorrow, and you do as well. Just do the next thing. And let God use that to progressively work in your life. All right, second, look at verse 3. "And she went and came and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and her hap was to light on a part of the field belonging unto Boaz," this one who was the kindred of Elimelech. Number 2, guided through progressive hospitality. The word there is hospitality. Notice how this field is open to her. And I love the word there, maybe a bit different than we would word it. The word hap has the idea of just happened. She just happened to be in this field of Boaz. She just happened to be found in the place where this one would receive her and minister to her needs and ultimately would be a part of God's redemptive plan. Can I ask you this question? Did she really just happen to stumble into this field? Did it just happen? We all know that's not the case, right? It's almost as if the author, the writer, is just kind of keeping us engaged with how this is worded here. God was behind the scenes guiding Ruth and directing her. The same providence that led the Magi to Bethlehem with the stars, the same God who led Ruth to this field. Years before that, to bring about his plan, God was guiding her to this place that would receive her. Ruth just happened to come to Boaz's field because God is gracious and sovereign. I love this. One author said, God is gracious and sovereign even when he is silent. God's not referenced here in verses 1 to 3, but he is in control of all the details. He's working this, he's pulling the strings, he's orchestrating and choreographing the script. Could it be God is silent in your life tonight, but he is working? Would you be willing to consider that? That he's progressively leading, and in our day when it seems like God is silent in certain precincts of our culture and our world, I would just encourage us, maybe he's more at work right now than we've ever sensed him to be. He's still sovereign. He's still in control. He's still a God who is tender. He's a God who is engaged. And so we see God working here through these progressive steps. One way to sense how the Lord is leading is to simply walk through the doors of opportunity and relationship that he gives to you. Just one step at a time. Just take it one conversation, one engagement, one interaction at a time. And so the question tonight is, are you willing to yield to and trust in a God who unfolds his redemptive plan in your life one incremental step at a time? And I would just say this and we'll move on. God does it that way not because he's messing with us, but because he loves us. And he knows exactly how to get his will done in the best manner. We simply must trust him. I think we have time to look at it. Would you go back to the book of Proverbs for just a moment? There's other verses in Proverbs that would probably speak to this, but just two that resonate with me. Proverbs 20 and verse 24, this idea of just the next step, just do the next thing. These two verses speak to this. Proverbs 20, and if you would please, verse 24. Proverbs 20 and verse 24, man's goings are of the Lord. How can a man then understand his own way? Man's goings are of the Lord. And so where we're going and where things seem to be shifting or moving toward is of the Lord. And then back to Proverbs 16 and verse 9. One of my favorite verses that relates to our decisions and then God's oversight of those decisions. Proverbs 16 and verse 9. A man's heart deviseth his way, and I have that word deviseth circled on my Bible, but the Lord directeth, and I have that word circled as well, his steps. The Lord directs his steps. What a gift from God. We go in a direction and he directs those. Just do the next thing. Do what's right, and then trust God to bring about his will. Be willing to see these circumstances as being guided by the Lord. If I can convince you tonight, and more importantly, God can convince you that nothing is circumstantial in the sense we mean it, and God's involved in every detail of how you're made, where you're at, what losses and pluses you have, that's a part of his plan for your life. It just changes your view. There are things I don't like about life, and I don't really appreciate about maybe certain elements of it, and I have it better than many and most, but I'm in the center of God's will. Do I believe that tonight, and am I living in light of that? And the same question also should be asked and answered by you. And so let him lead you through these circumstances that he is a part of. All right, secondly, go to verse 4. And let's spend the balance of our time looking at how God does this work personally in the life of Boaz and Ruth. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said unto the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered, the Lord bless thee. Verse 5, then said Boaz unto his servant that was set over the reapers, whose damsel is this? Number two, so we have circumstances that are guided by God. Number two, we have circumstances that are favorable. Not only does God guide our circumstances, he also creates circumstances that are favorable to his plan being worked out in our lives. I heard someone tongue-in-cheek saying, my boss, they were at work and their boss said, have a good day. He said, so I went home. That was his response to having a good day. Do you know that our view of a good day or being in a good place is not always the way God sees it? Like circumstances that are favorable to God's plan are not always favorable from our perspective. But we need to trust him and yield to him, and we see this happening, these favorable circumstances in Ruth's life that led to this redemptive plan. This morning, Brother Joe was with us in the morning service. Was it not good to see him today? And if I were not careful, what I was thinking was, I'm sure Brother Joe's glad to be back in church. It's been a while. And he said to me, caught me, and challenged that thought. He said, it's hard to be here the first Sunday without Miss Wilma. That was in his mind. Just text back and forth with Brother Andrew and Miss Mandy this week, and Brother Andrew's having a battle. He's still in the hospital tonight, hopefully going to get out tomorrow. Favorable circumstances are not always what we would prefer. I would not choose that for Brother Joe. I would not choose that for Brother Andrew and his family. But circumstances that God allows, listen to me, are the most favorable place and setting for us to experience his plan. Because there's more going on than our comfort and our convenience and our preferences. He's got something bigger that he's doing. And so we need to see our circumstances as, God, thank you. You've said you're in control, and you got my best in mind, and this is the best thing for me right now. This is going to lead to the best. All things may not be good in and of themselves, but they work together for good, those that are called according to his purpose. And so God is working out these circumstances. Listen, there's no place better for God to do his will in your life than where you're at tonight. With all the pluses and negatives, right where you're at is where God has put you to do his will. And when we start with that bias, it changes the lens from resentment and chafing underneath of that, instead rejoicing in a day that God made with all that that involves. All right, a couple things about that as it relates to this, dear family. Number one, allow God to be tender where you are exclusively favored. All right, so we see this exclusive favor that is put upon Ruth. She didn't deserve it. She was a Moabitess. And yet we see this exclusive favor that God gives to her. Allow God to be tender where you are exclusively favored. Notice, first of all, she is favored with exclusive support. In verses 4 to 9, she is given support that other women in this day would not have received. Even those who were native to Israel, she receives exclusive support. And so in verse 4, we see that there's this reference to Boaz's spirituality. In verse 4, notice that he greets these that are working for him. The Lord be with you, and they respond in like kind. The Lord bless thee. This man was a spiritual man. You want to know a man, who he really is? Go to work with him. See how he engages not just with those who are peers or over him, but those who are beneath him. That's how you judge a man. And this man was spiritually minded toward those who were laboring in his fields. God had given to Ruth a godly man, a man who loved God and was saturated with pleasing him in his relationships with not just spiritual activity, but even his vocational profession. And so we see he greets them with the Lord. And then verses 5 to 7, it's almost Boaz is just looking over the field and what's going on. And then a woman catches his eye, and he turns to his foreman there of the crew and begins to inquire about her. And so you see the response of the foreman here. Notice in verse 6, the servant that was set over the reapers answered and said, "It is the Moabitish damsel that came back with Naomi out of the country of Moab. And she said, I pray you let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. So she came, and hath continued even from morning until now, that she tarried a little in the house." And so his assessment is she's a hard worker. She's exhibiting this initiative that we talked about just a moment ago. She's worked from morning until evening. She has labored with very few breaks. I think it's interesting to me that one of the things often we do when we receive exclusive favor is that we don't do enough with it. What Ruth was given here, she did the best she could with it. This favor she had been given, she sought to steward it with labor and effort, and even this foreman respected what this woman was demonstrating, her work ethic, her initiative, her drive, her commitment, from sun up to sundown. What are we doing with the exclusive favor that God has given to us? You do know that we are in a very favorable position. The resources that we have, I'm amazed at how many Bibles we all own, how many podcasts we have access to, how much Christian radio, and the list goes on and on and on. Relationship with other believers that are here tonight. What are we doing with the exclusive favor that God has given to us that we do not deserve? His providence is all around us. His fingerprints of tenderness are all around us. Are we stewarding well this exclusive favor that God has given to us in our day? What are we doing with it as we see Ruth in the text? All right, verse 8. Then said Boaz unto Ruth, Hearest thou not, my daughter? Go not to glean. So these are the first words out of the lips of Boaz to Ruth. Do you remember when you first saw your spouse? That first moment, the first words that were said. This is the first dialogue between these two heroes of the story, God being ultimately the hero. Hearest thou not, my daughter? Go not to glean another field, neither go from hence, but abide here fast by my maidens. Let thine eyes be on the field that they do reap, and go thou after them. Have I not charged the young men, they shall not touch thee? And when thou art athirst, go into the vessels and drink of that which the young men have drawn. And so she is given a place of favor. Hate to burst your bubble. I don't know what you've pictured. We all have in our mind's eye like the characters of a Bible story. Like if I ask you, what does Joseph look like? Or what did Jesus look like? Or whoever. We tend to have in our mind like an image. Ruth, I would guess probably with the sequence, probably, mid-20s, something of that nature. Boaz is much older. Okay, he refers to her, as you notice there in verse number 8, her daughter. This may be the extreme, but some Jewish tradition would teach that Boaz was pushing even 80 years of age. Obviously, this was a different setting. The age of of how long folks will live, but it wasn't two young lovers, okay, just kind of kicking up their heels and frolicking through the fields as they observe the harvest. That's not the setting here. And so we see that Boaz is a mature man, and he is seeking to minister to her and give her favor that would lead to her being a part of several harvests, the barley harvest, probably the wheat harvest, this lengthy period of blessing and favor that God gave to Ruth. And so this favor with exclusive support. All right, number 2 then, look at verse 10. We see a second aspect of this exclusive favor. Not only was it supportive in that, hey, I'm going to help you be successful and provide for your family. Look if you will now at verse number 10. Then she, Ruth, fell on her face and bowed herself to the ground and said unto him, Why have I found grace in thine eyes? Should we not all ask God that? Like, why have we found grace? Why does He love us? Why is He involved in the details and nuances of our life? Why have we received His favor? Why have we found grace in His eyes? That thou shouldest take knowledge of me, seeing I am a stranger. And Boaz, notice this, answered and said unto her, It hath been fully showed to me all that thou hast done unto thy mother-in-law since the death of thine husband, and now thou hast left thy father and thy mother in the land of thy nativity, and art come unto a people which thou knewest not heretofore. Secondly, notice she is favored with exclusive affirmation. So she is given support that is exclusively, I think, provided to her by God. Number 2, she is affirmed. Today, Carter got baptized. We had 4 of our young people get baptized this morning, if you weren't here, and Carter was sporting his Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle shorts, every faithful disciple of Jesus should have those on a baptism Sunday. But I was joking with Brother Nick afterwards. Most of the kids, as soon as I start talking, and Pastor Dave's been a part of these as well, they're just focused on trying to get their hand over their nose, right, Carter? They're trying to get all that right. And so as soon as I start talking, they plug their nose, and I'm hoping they're not going to pass out. So I start talking quicker if they do that. Carter, unlike the others, they're just looking ahead, the hand, as he turned and squared up and listened to me. Did you notice that? And it was just like, hey, Pastor, I actually care what you say. Or he's like, do I trust this guy to let me push me into the water? I don't know what is the case. But affirming with attention. Have you ever tried to talk to someone and they're not even making eye contact with you, and then you have somebody that just, they listen. They open up to you. And we see this affirmation of Boaz. There's an immediate connection. There's an immediate openness on the part of this man that leads to the affirmation of Ruth. Now, this thought, before verse 11, where had Ruth gotten any encouragement for everything she had just sacrificed? I challenge you, go back through all of chapter 1 through verse number 10 or verse number 8 of chapter 2. Where is someone say, great job, Ruth, God's using you, God's work, what great, never. And yet here, God, she doesn't affirm herself, God validates, God affirms, God encourages her. And we see that through the lips of this man Boaz. He had heard of all that she had done to Naomi. He had heard that she had sacrificed much, and so he affirms her. And Proverbs 27:2 reminds us, let another man praise thee and not thine own mouth, a stranger and not thine own lips. And so we see this happening, this affirmation. All right, now, one of my favorite verses in all of the book is verse 12. Would you go there? The Lord recompense thy work. So he affirms her character, her sacrifices. The Lord recompense thy work, and the full reward be given thee of the Lord God of Israel. And then notice this last phrase, under whose wings thou art come to trust. Under whose wings thou art come to trust. And so we see Boaz praying that God will reward Ruth, that God will shine his favor upon her. And he uses here this, what would be called a zoomorphism, where he uses the analogy of an animal. It's used in other times where Christ says, how oft would I have gathered thee as a hen does her chicks, as he overlooked Jerusalem. But he compares this relationship between God and Ruth to the idea that Ruth is under the wings of God. And so this prayer that would be answered, and by the way, the one who prays it in verse 12 is going to be the one who is the answer to that prayer. Isn't that interesting? Later, Ruth will say, down in verse number 9, Spread thy skirt over thine handmaid. And so this idea of under whose wings thou hast come to trust. And so this affirmation, this encouragement that Ruth receives for the first time in the story. And the imagery of verse number 12 is that of a tiny bird struggling under the wings of a foster mother. Ruth had been a Moabitess. She had been worshiping false gods. That's how she was brought up. And now she's under the wings of Jehovah. She has been redeemed. She is now a follower of God himself, the one true God. And so we see this affirmation given to her by this man Boaz. And I guess the takeaway would be this. We can try to open doors ourselves or try to run our own PR campaign, or we can, listen to me, just follow God. His circumstances, His favor in our lives, let Him take care of us as we see Ruth so graciously doing. And so this response to the favor of God that we see in Ruth's life. All right, go now, if you will, to verse number 13. We'll end tonight in verse 17, but notice her response now to this recognition or affirmation. Then she said, "Let me find favor in thy sight, my Lord, for thou hast comforted me, and for that thou hast spoken friendly unto thy handmaid, though I be not like unto one of thine handmaidens." Number 2, lastly, allow God to be tender where you are consequentially favored. The word there is consequentially. Someone the other day was talking about, and it's kind of weird when you first think about it, and I don't try to do this in church, but have you ever thought about the fact there's certain parts of your face that you have never actually seen? Now, you've seen a reflection of your face, but there's certain, don't try to do it right now, okay, that you would lose your dignity, as I did earlier trying it. But there's certain parts of my facial anatomy that I will never see from my own eyeballs. I cannot physically do that, okay? Maybe with some plastic surgery or other things, maybe I could, but like, he was talking about your forehead. Like, try looking at your forehead without the use of a mirror or your phone or something else. There's just certain parts of our face that we don't see, at least on a regular basis, even with help, and we've never actually seen it in all of its glory or lack of glory, okay? It's kind of like your voice. Have you ever heard on a video recording, and you're like, that's not me, that's not how I sound. Because we're listening within our own head, with our ears that are attached to the same head that's speaking. And so it's distorted often by our perspective. And there was an article in the news this past week that talked about how this is affecting us in our day. The article said, new research published in the International Journal of Women's Dermatology reveals hours in front of video calls is leading some people to get cosmetic procedures. Which is crazy, but this is true. A team of dermatologists have coined the phrase Zoom dysmorphia. Dermatologist so-and-so from Harvard Medical School and Massachusetts General Hospital Department of Dermatology created the study with their peers. Doctors say that images that we see of ourselves are often distorted and not a true reflection of what we really look like. It went on to talk about that cosmetic surgery is on the rise because often when you're on a conference call, you're looking at yourself and like, what's wrong with me? I look off today, okay? Or whatever the case, or I don't like my nose, or whatever the thing that bothers you when you look at that. You know what's interesting to me about Ruth is the more that she learned about what God had for her, the more humbling it was to her. She didn't get caught up in herself. She didn't get caught up in her profile. It was about something bigger than just herself. Now, this is key tonight. God-orchestrated circumstances are intended to have God-intended consequences. Can I give that to you again? God-orchestrated circumstances are intended to have God-intended consequences. So I think here's what we do. Like, we're in the midst of circumstances, and all we're thinking about is, do I like what's happening in my life, the direction I'm going, instead of, where is God trying to take this? What are the consequences? What are the things that are going to happen as a result of where I'm at today, where I'm at tonight, where I'll be this week? God has consequences that He is directing us toward. An author I was reading said this: salvation is for us, of course. God doesn't need it, so He doesn't need salvation. But it is not mainly about us. Salvation is mainly about God. Like, even our salvation is not for us ultimately. It's for God. And so I think sometimes as we're working through God's redemptive plan, we're focused too much upon ourselves. And Ruth fights that. She bucks that trend with her humility. All right, two things under that quickly and we're done. Number one, favored with humbling, the word there that I just mentioned, favored with humbling consequences. We see, though Boaz gives her all these affirming words that could have stirred her to pride, she responds in humility. In fact, she says, I feel like I'm not as good as your handmaidens. I don't deserve to have any place of affirmation. Somebody I follow online posted this the other day. I thought this was good. The question was, what sort of people does God see, save, accept, pardon, live with, regard, lead, teach, revive, uplift, gladden, grace, and exalt? All of them, the only ones he does are those that are humble. And the reason, listen to me, that God's not on the move in your life and mine where he wants to be. He's got us where he wants us, but we've got pride. It's not that we need a change of circumstances. We need a change of heart. To just humble ourselves and say, God, you got me right where you want me. I'm going to yield to your will and your work and let you lead and move in my life. Humble yourself under the mighty hand of God. And so it is not a change of circumstance we need. It's a change of our heart. One author said this, grace is not intended to replace lowliness with pride. It is intended to replace sorrow with joy. Grace is not intended to replace lowliness with pride. Is intended to replace sorrow with joy. God wanted to give to Ruth joy, but he didn't want her to use that as an excuse to have pride. And so be humbled by the place that God has you. Humble people don't make it about themselves. They simply want to see God's will done in them. All right, and then lastly, verses 14 to 17. I love this. Boaz's provision for her. And Boaz said unto her, at mealtime come thou hither and eat of the bread, and dip thy morsel in the vinegar. And she sat beside the reapers and reached her parched corn, and she did eat and was sufficed and left. And when she had risen up to glean, Boaz commanded his young man, saying, notice this continued provision, let her glean even among the sheaves, and reproach her not. Verse 16, I love this little phrase. I don't know if this will jump out to you. And let fall also some of the handfuls of purpose for her. I love that, handfuls of purpose for her. And leave them that she may glean them and rebuke her not. So she gleaned even in the field until even and beat out that she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. Lastly, jot this down, favored with productive consequences. So humbling consequences. Number two, productive. I don't know why I was on the Reader's Digest kick this week as I was preparing this, but read the story of the guy said one of his wife's third graders, she's a teacher, was wearing a Fitbit watch. So third grader in his wife's class was wearing a Fitbit watch, which prompted his wife to ask, are you tracking your steps? Was the question that she asked of her third grader. To which the little girl said, no, I'm wearing this for mommy so she can show it to daddy when he gets home tonight. Productivity. Do you ever try to farm out or delegate off your productivity? Ruth was taking what God gave her and being productive with it. It didn't just happen for her. I mean, she was one tired gal by the end of this chapter. And she exhausted herself. She did her part, and God used all of this, all the ephahs and all the farming and all the agricultural setting that was there to produce what God had intended. But it took her effort. It took her steps of faith and obedience. And I love that phrase, as I said, I have underlined in my Bible, handfuls of purpose. God was working directly in her life and moved this man to leave things on purpose for her, handful after handful, that all added up to God's provision in her life. In the verse 17 where it says that she beat out that she had gleaned, so she had to work with it even after she had gathered it, obviously. And it was about an ephah of barley. I don't know if the word ephah is a word that you just drop regularly into normal conversation and you know exactly what that means. I drop words into conversation, I just don't maybe know what they mean. But an ephah was about half of a bushel. So it would have likely weighed 30 pounds plus what she now took. And she may have had that on her head in a basket or something of that sort in that culture. But she takes back 30 pounds of what she has gleaned, this provision, this overwhelming abundance of what God had provided for her. Can you imagine Ruth as she walks back home that evening? A childless, widowed, foreign girl who has seen God provide for her. Are we going to go home tonight from church and say, I can't believe how many circumstances God has choreographed today to meet my needs, to work in my family, to work in our church? Are you seeing him in the circumstances? Ruth had to be overwhelmed by what God had done for her and the tender providence of God that was so active in her life. Do you see it? Do you trust for it? Do you believe it in the areas that God has given to you? How do you handle the favor God sends to you, the God who is so tender? Are you willing to appreciate that favor? Are you willing to steward that favor more in a way that leads to God's redemptive plan being worked out in your life? May you handle that favor as God would desire. I don't know about you, when things are going well, I tend to lose connection with God. I lean into Him when things are difficult. What about when you have His favor? Are you stewarding that in a way that pleases the Lord? All right, this last statement. I came across this in my reading the other day and copied the picture, but I think this is a great way for us to look at life. While other worldviews lead us to sit in the midst of life's joys, foreseeing the coming sorrows. Have you run into anybody that's viewing life that way? Instead of being that, Christianity empowers its people to sit in the midst of this world's sorrows, tasting the coming joy. Do not allow where you're at and what's going on to be all that defines you. God is using the circumstances right now to lead us to a joyful place, to lead us to an eternal place of joy. Would you trust Him enough to see Him in the circumstances that are part of your life even this evening? We are not victims of fate. We are not victims of circumstance. We worship a God, listen to me, who is tenderly and intimately involved in every nuance of our lives. Every breath, every thought, every moment. He's in those moments. He's in those breaths. He's in those thoughts. Would you see them? Would you sense them? Would you steward them for the glory and honor of God? And I would end with this. I think we see in Boaz, you probably already have anticipated where we're going, but Boaz is a type of Christ, is he not? I would remind you of just a few things that we've read tonight that would give us that thought. He was a man of great wealth in verse 1. He was compassionate to a stranger in verses 8 and 9. He knew about Ruth before she met him in verse 11. And is not God the same toward us? Is not Jesus the same toward us as our Redeemer? May we see God, may we see His redemptive plan in the circumstances of our lives. This question, we're done. Will you allow a tender God to draw near you and redeem circumstances that He is guiding and that He's using to bring His favor into our lives? Let's pray. Lord, thank you for your word tonight.